Before we learn about any of the individual intelligence tests, which we will be doing in the next two lessons that I'm going to post, I think it's really important for you to have an understanding of how intelligence tests get created. So this little presentation is just going to be about the process of creating any sort of psychological assessment, kind of what are the criteria that a test needs to meet in order for it to be widely accepted by the scientific and psychological community. So there are three essential criteria for acceptance. Acceptance meaning it's regarded by psychologists and by people who kind of understand psychology as being something that is valid and being something that is legitimate. Certainly, y'all have run into a whole lot of different types of tests online, personality tests, intelligence tests, a whole lot of things that people publish, but those rarely are going to meet these criteria, so certainly they're fun to take and it's fun to kind of post on your Facebook wall, but they're not things that are 100% respected by the psychological community. In order for a test to be accepted by the psychological community, first it needs to undergo a process known as standardization. Second, it needs to fulfill a requirement known as reliability. And third, it needs to have what we would call validity. So we're going to go through each one of these in greater detail and go over the definitions, go over some examples, so hopefully you will better understand them. All right, so the first criterion that we have listed, standardization, is defined as defining meaningful scores by comparison with the performance of a pre-tested group. So what does this actually mean? Basically, when you take an intelligence test or any test and you get your score back, that score itself doesn't really mean anything. You know, you get back a piece of paper, it says your IQ is 75, and you're looking at that number and you're thinking to yourself, okay, that's great, I have a 75, but what does that actually mean? In order for you to understand what that score means, you kind of need to know what the averages of that test are. It's just like when you get a test back even from one of your teachers. So I hand back a test in the class and you look at your grade and you see you got like a 92. And maybe at first you're really excited, but then the first thing everyone starts to do is they start to look around and they look at, what did the person next to them get? Did they get a really, really good grade? Did they get a low grade? You want to know, is your score good or bad in comparison with everyone else? So when you're making an intelligence test, the first step that it has to go through is you have to give the test to a whole bunch of people, because you need to know what are the average scores for this test going to be. If you don't know the average scores prior to really giving it out to a bunch of people, you're not going to have any clue how to actually say a score has meaning. So you give the test to a whole bunch of people, you get all those results back, you look at all of the averages, and that way when you get a score of, say, a 75, you're able then to compare it to people who have taken the test before and figure out where that puts you on that scale. Now, the goal of standardization is to arrive at a distribution of scores which fits what we would call the normal curve. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the normal curve before. You've heard of the bell curve before. What you're looking at here is the normal curve of one of the most famous intelligence tests, the Wechsler intelligence test. And with the normal curve, what we have is the bulk of people are going to score right here in this center section. So 78% of people are going to have scores that fall in that range. So from 85 to 115, that's how the average person is going to score. Now, you also see that there are going to be some scores that lay all the way out here or back here. These scores are going to be considered either the very, very low score, so very, very below average, or the super duper high score, so they're really above average. And so if you have a score in either one of those extremes, that's saying that you are very different from the norm. So the goal of any intelligence test is to be created so that most people score right here in the center, and then you just have a couple of outliers who are going to score really low or really high. It's just like when I create a test for you guys, or when I'm, grading your final exam, I don't want to see everyone getting 25s. If everyone's getting 25s and the bulk of people are getting 25s, that means there's something wrong with my assessment. I want the bulk of people to be scoring right smack dab in the middle of whatever the scores are. Now, interestingly enough, it's not just intelligence scores which tend to fall according to the normal curve. A lot of things in life tend to arrange themselves in this way. If you kind of look at this picture here, obviously it's only a couple of people, but if you look at the heights, they pretty much fit a normal curve. And so we find that with a lot of things in life, height, weight, that kind of thing, they tend to distribute themselves according to the normal curve. So if we were actually in school today, we could line up everyone in the class and we could arrange ourselves so that we would fit very much a normal curve. Most people would be right around the same height, and then we're going to have, a couple of people who are super duper short and a couple of people who might be super duper tall, but for the most part, our heights are going to be very average, and we're going to be able to cluster ourselves into a bell shape. Now, once you've made sure that your test fits the criteria of standardization, so you've given it out to a bunch of people, you've gotten your scores back, you understand what a good score is, what a bad score is, because you're able to compare it to a pre-tested group, you then have to worry about the consistency of your scores. So this is what's known as reliability. You want to know that your instrument or your assessment or your intelligence test is going to be able to yield the same results for the same person over time. If you're saying that you're measuring someone's intelligence, that's not something that should change drastically over the years. If you have an IQ of 75 at age 5, you should also have an IQ pretty close to that at age 25. So reliability is defined as the extent to which a test yields consistent results, and it just means that your score should stay pretty much the same over time. Now, there are two ways of measuring reliability. So the first one is what's known as test-retest reliability. This just means that you take a test at one point in life, you get your score back, you take it again maybe a year later, and should get a pretty similar score. A lot of you might have experienced this form of reliability before. I think most of you have taken the SAT at this point, and so if you've taken the SAT multiple times, it's really rare to get drastically different scores. Obviously, your score is going to go up or down a smidgen, but it shouldn't vary by 500, 600, 700 points, because that would be a problem with the test itself. So if you took an IQ test one time and you scored super duper high, and then you took, another IQ test a year later and you got very different results, that would be a problem. So we would say that in this situation, that IQ test would lack test-retest reliability. Now, a second way of measuring consistency on your test and being able to tell if your test is reliable is through something called split-half reliability. So in this situation, you have someone take a test, and then you're going to first compute whatever their score would be based on, for example, all of the even number questions. Then you'd go back and you'd do the same thing, only this time you'd find their score for all of the odd numbered questions. And if they match up, you would say that your test has split half reliability. You've split the test in half, and you've been able to see that, yup, your test is consistent. It doesn't matter, what questions you take. You can take the odds, you can take the evens. You're going to get consistent results. Now, the third and final criteria that any intelligence test or any psychological assessment at all needs to meet is what is known as validity. So we say that a test is valid if it measures or predicts what it's supposed to. So if you have what is claiming to be an intelligence test, it's valid if it actually is measuring intelligence test. So to give you kind of an example of that, we're going to demonstrate an instrument which might have really high reliability, but which, as hopefully you're going to see, doesn't have a lot of validity. Because you can have something which is reliable, which gives consistent scores, but isn't necessarily valid, meaning it's not measuring at all what it claims to measure. So here we have a picture of Derek Jeter, famous baseball player, Yankees captain. Some people claim that he is super duper attractive. And what we're going to do is we are going to attempt to measure how tall Derek is using a ruler that I'm providing. Alright, so here we have a ruler. I'm going to tell you that it is a 6-foot long ruler, and we're going to put it up next to Derek, and we're going to see how tall it tells us that he is. So if we take our ruler and we put it right next to him, we can count. Okay, we have 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet tall. So this is saying, yep, Derek Jeter is 4 feet tall. You might say, I don't know, Miss Corcoran, I don't think he's really 4 feet tall. That seems kind of short. Okay, let's try again. So we've got our ruler again. We're going to make sure, okay, it's nice and lined up right next to him. We're going to count off again. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. Okay, still saying he's 4 feet tall. Now, hopefully, as you can see by this point, I could do this a million times, and this instrument is still going to tell me that Derek Jeter is 4 feet tall. However, hopefully y'all are smart enough to know that he is nowhere near 4 feet tall. So this ruler here, while it is reliable, so it's giving us consistent scores, it is in no way valid. Even though it claims to be able to measure someone's height, it's clearly not actually measuring that. So you can have an instrument which is reliable, but which is not valid. Now, just like with reliability, there were 2 ways of assessing it. There are 2 ways of assessing validity. First way that we have is what is known as content validity. This is defined as the extent to which a test samples the behavior that is of interest. So for me, I think a better way of understanding that is, does your test have an adequate sample of relevant information? So let's say that you are taking a final exam for me. So it's your final psychology exam. You study, really, really hard. You study all the different chapters. You sit down to take the exam, and every single question is from the chapter on the brain and states of consciousness. That clearly would not have an adequate sample of information. I'm telling you, it's a test about the entire year. It's your final, but when you sit down and take it, it's only about a very, very, very small portion of information. Another example. Maybe you're going for your driving test. So you go, you sit down, you're really nervous because you really want to get your driver's license, and you're ready to have to do a whole bunch of things to demonstrate that you're a really good driver. So the driving instructor says, all right, I want you to pull out of the parking space. You do that. He says, all right, I want you to turn on your headlights. You do that. They say, all right, I want you to pull back in the parking space. You pass the test. Here you go. Here's your license. While that's a really great way for you, I suppose, to get your license because you'll be really excited you actually passed, clearly this doesn't have content validity because you've only had to demonstrate a couple of things which have to do with driving as opposed to demonstrate every single thing about driving. So if a test is claiming to measure intelligence, it can't just measure one component of intelligence, it has to measure all the different aspects of it in order to have content validity. Now, the second way of measuring validity and seeing does the test measure what it claims to measure is through something known as predictive validity. This is the idea that a test is supposed to be able to predict a behavior that it's designed to predict. So an intelligence test is saying, if you perform well on this test, you should also therefore perform well on other related activities. So if you have a super high IQ, you should also probably do well in school. If you go back to the driving test example, you pass a driving test, you should also therefore maybe be a better driver, you should have a lower insurance rate, you shouldn't get into a lot of accidents. So there should be some way of looking at your score on the current test and predicting other related behaviors and other related performance.